Paul Wilkinson, you're very welcome today to Project Management Paradise. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Paul, we have a big topic today, and it's big in size and big, I guess, in publicity as well. Digital transformation in engineering and construction, or the flip side of that may be, or lack thereof. But before we get into that, Paul, you have a very interesting background to yourself. So tell us how a doctor in criminology is now a guru in the engineering and construction sector.
I did public administration as a first degree, and then got interested in an aspect of the criminal justice system and started to do a PhD at the London School of Economics. And because you have to do a bit of field work, I couldn't do a full-time job, so I went part-time. And my first part-time job was as a temp. I was a copy typist, almost a Kelly girl, or one of the temp agencies in London. Took me into a consulting engineering business, spent 2 weeks there. Then my next assignment was 2 weeks at another consulting engineering firm. And I ended up spending 7 years there, ultimately. So I became initially a permanent employee, but still part-time. And when I finished my PhD fieldwork, sadly, Margaret Thatcher had decided there was no such thing as society, which for a sociologist is a bit of a death knell for your future career as a sociologist. But by then I was already working for this consulting engineering firm, enjoying the work. And so it wasn't a painful decision for me to focus full time on becoming more of a PR and marketeer, because that's the department I was working in within that organisation.
Excellent. So things have moved a long way too since you were probably on a golf ball typewriter, and if we come now into the digital age, and that's progressing at a phenomenal rate as well. So why does this sector, the engineering and construction sector, lag behind in digital transformation?
I think it's because there's a number of factors. Traditionally, construction has been was a low tech industry. People did things, it was very manual, but it's very contractual, very adversarial, and people work to low margins. And when you've got low margins, overheads like IT are expensive, and so you tend not to use IT unless it provides you with a cost saving. So we're very cost conscious. As an industry, we also tend to work in silos, and that the adversarial relationships often meant that we weren't very good at sharing information, and so tended to revert to the lowest common denominator, which was producing paper and sharing paper and moving paper around. Even when computer-aided design techniques started to come in, it was still about reducing everything to paper. So if you compare where construction sits in terms of its digital transformation journey with other market sectors, McKinsey did a piece of research about 5 years ago and identified that in America, construction was bottom of the league, was almost bottom of the league. It was above agriculture and hunting. They did a similar piece of research in Europe, and construction was right at the bottom. Even agriculture in Europe is more advanced than construction in terms of its digital transformation. So that's where we sit, and the consequences of being so far behind do, however, mean that we can learn lessons from other sectors which have digitized, and we have the opportunity then to digitize more quickly, more efficiently, and learn from the lessons of people who were the early adopters in some of the marketplaces.
Yeah, exactly, and kind of leapfrog over the technology and have the latest and greatest implemented in probably a shorter space of time, with fewer delays, unlike frequently the construction industry. It was very easy, and I'm not saying this went on wholesale, but when everything was reduced to that paper denominator, it is the way lots of businesses worked, where you had checklists and there were the physical paper pieces. And it's also easy not to share that when you, as you said, you work in the silos. Do you think there's a transformation behind the actual digitization as well, where information will be shared more freely and frequently?
There will be. We're in the process of going through that journey at the moment. If I think back over the 30 years or so that I've been in the industry, about every 5 or 6 years, there's a major industry report which says construction is hugely inefficient and wasteful and needs to be better at collaborating. So we've had people talking about partnering, about integrated teams, about the use of collaboration platforms, and and more use of technology to improve how we collaborate, how we move on from being a paper-based, paper-driven industry, and working to the timescales of a paper-driven industry. So we move beyond that and become quicker and slicker in our processing. But it's been a slow process because this is an industry where people are delivering buildings and assets, roads and bridges and tunnels and transport networks and so on, upon which people's lives depend. So you're not going to take risks with new IT that's untested. And in many cases, that kind of conservative, risk-averse approach is indicative of many organizations' approach to new technology. Construction was amongst the slowest to adopt word processing. It was slow to adopt the World Wide Web. It was slow to, many of its businesses were amongst the slowest to create their first websites. So it's been an area of challenge for a long time. And if I think about my social media journey over the last 15 years, at one time I was one of a handful of people who were tweeting. Many people were effectively banned by their organizations from using any social media at all. It was just seen as not the thing that we do in construction.
So I'm very happy to see that you broke for the border, that you're well established on the World Wide Web now. So that kind of information dissemination, Paul, and other trends that you've mentioned, which of those in particular do you think will be more important for these sectors in the coming years?
Well, the big change that we've seen over the last 10 or 11 years has been building information modelling. So BIM, as it's frequently abbreviated, has been the big push that the UK government started in 2011. And it was looking to establish better ways of doing things. It wanted to create a more efficient industry, and also to address things like climate change through enabling better sharing of open, shareable asset information. We're still a long way short of delivering upon that vision, but we've gone a long way forward in terms of getting the industry to adopt BIM as a process. It's a collaborative process. It involves, the use of the development, sharing and use of a lot of structured information. It's not just about 3D models, it's about the wealth of other non-geometric information that will often sit behind a process during design, through construction, and then beyond handover into future operation of the buildings and assets themselves.
So like that in itself is a huge transformation, really turned the industry inside out. And one would hope, with all that it kind of pulls in with it, that everybody or every organization within the sector will come on board. But there are some suggestions perhaps that it is a closed book. Why would that be?
There's been some hesitation from some firms to invest in the technology. There are also issues to do with the technology and the nature of the information that's shared. There is a challenge around what we call interoperability, the ability to exchange and use information between different software solutions, so that I can send you something and you can immediately open it. But you can only, in the construction case, you might only be able to open it if you have a particular piece of software, the same software that I used to create the original file. And this sometimes poses problems because as a side, as very much as a silo-based industry, lots of disciplines working together. Firms don't necessarily use the same software tools. They might use different brands of software. Different disciplines might use different tools, and sometimes the tools just don't talk to each other. So we end up with a situation where you have to reduce things to their bare minimum. In some cases, that's reducing it almost down to paper again, back to PDF, before people can share. And people are also concerned about liabilities. They didn't want to accept information that came from other disciplines, because they might be liable for mistakes that were embedded in those files. They preferred to reconstitute the information so that they were comfortable that they wouldn't be compromised if something went wrong.
So that partly explains as well why this is still kind of almost in its infancy after 10 years of the program being introduced, really.
Yeah, well, if you think about other areas of commerce, the World Wide Web works because there are software protocols and programs which work to accepted global standards, so that you can open an internet browser, whichever browser you use, and it will open a website, and the website will look the same. Because everything's working to the same standards and protocols. It's the reason that email works. You don't have to be using, not everybody has to use Outlook. People can use Gmail and other products, but we can send email and attachments efficiently to each other because there are these protocols and standards in place. At the moment, construction lags behind in its development of the appropriate open standards that enable that kind of free flow of information between the disciplines. Other industries have tackled the issue, so you can look at how the automotive industry, for example, shares information with its supply chains, much more sophisticated in terms of how they share information seamlessly, just in time type information exchanges. That's where construction needs to get to in terms of its adoption of new standards to enable that kind of more rapid working.
And do you see any sea change in that adoption, Paul?
We're beginning to see changes in that. The UK government is starting to push interoperability as a requirement. So government construction strategy at the moment is captured in a couple of documents. The construction playbook, which came out December 2020, and then in September last year, we had the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap to 2030, sometimes just called the TIP Roadmap now. But the playbook and the TIP Roadmap, those two documents constitute UK government construction strategy. They talk about the need for greater sharing of better data, and the TIP roadmap includes an annex which talks about interoperability and makes it quite clear that this has to be part of the improvement process for the industry going forward. It's not an overnight thing. It's something that's going to take some years to implement, but that's why you have a strategy. It helps give the industry a direction and advises on the steps that need to be taken.
Excuse me, they look like interesting publications. So I've just taken a note of those for myself to follow up on. And synonymous with the engineering and construction sector, Paul, health and safety kind of goes hand in hand with that. And with all the government directives, and this, I understand, is pretty much on a worldwide basis where governments are putting huge focus on maintaining proper standards and, as you said, interoperability and consistency across all of the sectors. Why is health and safety itself, as a whole, does that delay the adoption of the technology in this sector?
I think it makes people. I think it depends which country you're in. Some countries around the world are much more rigid in their enforcement of health and safety legislation and regulations. But sometimes it takes a major incident for industry to wake up and realise that it's got to improve its practices. Things like working at height, falls from height are still one of the major causes of fatalities on construction sites, but there's a big difference in how that's managed in different countries. So you can see the differences in how the regulations are enforced in that way. But I think there's also a change that's coming partly due to the safe occupation of buildings is another aspect of this. In 2017, we had a major housing fire in London, the Grenfell disaster. Dozens of people died in a high-rise building, partly because the fire accelerated due to inflammable materials contained in the cladding. That's prompted quite a major change in how the UK is considering building safety. And so we're starting now to bring together the requirements for building safety, but also requirements for better data. And we're starting to talk about having a golden thread of building safety data as a requirement for all new buildings over a certain height, over 18 meters at the moment. But the regulation will probably be extended to lower rise buildings as well, and to buildings which are not necessarily residential in use. So there are changes afoot, and it's prompting a change not just in how the materials that we're talking about, but also how we manage. It'll be a requirement that information is kept updated throughout the whole life of an asset. So it puts a responsibility not just on the initial design and construction, but also the people who are responsible for maintaining an asset, owning an asset throughout its entire life cycle, so that they can reassure the occupants of a building that they're going to something which is where it's safe to do so.
That's really, really reassuring to hear, because it was certainly a disaster that grabbed global headlines for all of the wrong reasons. But that kind of data capture and that database then for all of the subsequent buildings, and I'm sure that there might be some kind of retrospective period for where we have data. Obviously, we can't have it for every kind of building, but that communal data bank will just be a mine of information for subsequent construction, I guess. And part of what you mentioned earlier on is lessons learned about what we've done before and how to avoid something like that happening again. Oh, there's so much in there, really and truly. Do you think that we'll ever see a kind of universal construction standard?
I think we've got approaches which are increasingly international. Talking about BIM, what started in the UK as a drive to improve building information modelling in the UK, we saw the emergence of a series of standards, PASs, publicly available specifications, that they became the building blocks for British standards, and in due course they became part of an ISO standard. So the International Standards Organization now has ISO 19650 as the international standard for building information management, covering not just design and construction, but also operation and security of information as well. So, it's what started as a UK initiative now has global credentials, and also within under the umbrella of the international standards, countries can also create a kind of national annex, a national view of how they interpret that international standard, so that it's applicable to their market as well. So, there are the framework, the international framework is there, and you therefore then got the scope to customize those to particular country requirements.
Good. Well, I'm sure there are millions of people around the world delighted to hear that. I certainly, for one, am. I am a great believer in digitization and sharing of information. Transparency and communication is paramount, I think, to achieving a lot of positive results in project and program delivery. Paul Wilkinson, thank you so much for your time today. I think we've a lot that we'd like to talk about in the future again with you, and maybe take a timestamp in a while and see how things are getting on with the construction.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. I write about these developments in my blog, which is extranetevolution.com. And if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, the EE of Extranet Evolution is the first part of my Twitter handle. I'm EE Paul on Twitter, so you can follow me there. And yeah, I tweet about some of these issues from time to time as well.
Excellent. Well, I'll be one of your new followers.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Paul.